The hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the muffled shuffle of passengers still stowing luggage in the overhead bins. Flight attendants moved with the familiar grace of those who had repeated these motions 1,000 times, guiding families, businessmen, and weary travelers to their seats. Among them sat a man who could easily draw eyes without saying a word. His name was Charles Whitmore, a millionaire known in business circles for his investments and his carefully curated image of success. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his wrist heavy with a watch worth more than most cars, Charles projected authority and affluence, even in the cramped quarters of economy class. But this time, he wasn't traveling alone. Beside him, nestled in a sleek leather stroller, was his infant son. From the very moment the plane doors sealed shut and the air grew thick with recycled pressure, the baby began to cry. At first, it was a whimper, a soft protest against the unfamiliar confinement. But as the engines roared to life and the aircraft tilted skyward, the protest swelled into full, piercing wails that echoed across the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations halted. A few passengers smiled sympathetically. Others rolled their eyes, already dreading a long flight filled with the relentless cries of a child. Charles shifted uncomfortably. His wealth had given him access to private jets before, where crying babies drew no judgment from strangers. But today his private aircraft was undergoing maintenance, and he was forced to share space with ordinary passengers. He bounced the child gently in his arms, whispering, "Shh, it's all right," though the words carried no comfort. The cries only grew louder, rattling even the seasoned travelers who tried to bury themselves in books or headphones. In seat 23B, near the middle of the cabin, sat a young black girl named Amara. She was no more than 16, her frame delicate, her clothes worn but neat. She traveled alone, her belongings stuffed into a second-hand backpack that sat beneath her seat. Life had not been kind to her. Anyone could see that in the quiet weight she carried in her eyes, but she bore it with a kind of grace rarely recognized by those around her. Amara leaned her head against the window, watching the clouds swell beneath the wing, yet her attention couldn't escape the cries cutting through the air. Passengers grew restless. A woman across the aisle muttered about parents these days. A businessman near the front snapped at a flight attendant, demanding she do something to control the noise. Charles's face flushed with embarrassment, his patience thinning. He wasn't used to the eyes of disapproval, wasn't accustomed to feeling powerless. He had made empires bend to his will, signed deals that shaped industries, and yet here, on this flight, his own child's cries reduced him to helplessness. The flight attendants tried to assist, offering warm bottles, suggesting walks down the aisle. Nothing worked. The cries came in waves, sharp and unyielding. An hour passed, then another, and tension in the cabin began to thicken. Passengers who had once been polite now exchanged annoyed glances. Charles noticed. He could almost feel their judgment, the unspoken accusations that he wasn't capable, that wealth couldn't buy him the simplest ability to comfort his own son. Amara's heart ached as she listened. She remembered her little brother, whom she used to cradle when their mother worked long hours at the diner. She remembered how he had cried too, and how her own gentle hums of lullabies, songs passed down from her grandmother, had been the only thing that soothed him. The memory stirred something inside her, though she sat frozen, hesitant. After all, who was she? Just a poor black girl, invisible to the world, sitting among passengers who wouldn't look twice at her. Approaching a man like Charles Whitmore felt unthinkable, almost dangerous. But as another piercing wail broke the uneasy quiet, Amara found herself rising from her seat. Her movements were cautious, almost apologetic, as if she expected someone to stop her. A few heads turned in curiosity. Charles looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of this thin, brown-skinned girl standing before him. He had seen her earlier, quietly boarding with worn sneakers and a backpack too small for the journey. She looked out of place to him, out of place in his world, certainly out of place in his row. "Sir," Amara said softly, her voice steady but respectful. "May I try?" Charles blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Try what?" "With the baby," she said, gesturing gently toward the child whose tiny fists waved in the air as his cries tore at the silence again. Sometimes they just need a different kind of comfort. His instinct was to refuse. Who was she to offer help? His pride flared, and the idea of handing his son to a stranger, a girl who, in his eyes, had nothing, seemed absurd. The businessman in him calculated risks instantly: disease, liability, appearances. But the father in him, weary and worn after hours of fruitless attempts, hesitated. Around him, passengers watched with subtle anticipation, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. Charles's jaw tightened. "I don't think." But then his baby screamed again, the sound so sharp it drew a groan from a man in the back row. Charles's defenses crumbled under the weight of exhaustion and humiliation. With a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Fine. If you think you can do better." Amara didn't flinch at the sharpness in his tone. She simply extended her arms, and, with a hesitant pause, Charles placed the infant into her care. The baby's small body was warm, trembling with the force of its own cries. Amara cradled him gently against her chest, her movements instinctive, born not from training but from lived experience. She began to sway, her steps small as she hummed softly. It was a lullaby in a language most on the plane didn't understand, half words, half melody, the kind of song that carried the memory of mothers and grandmothers who had sung through hardship. Her voice was low and tender, weaving through the cries until, slowly, unbelievably, the child's sobs began to falter. His wails softened into whimpers, then hiccups, and finally into silence. His tiny eyelids fluttered shut as he surrendered to sleep against her shoulder. A hush fell over the cabin. The restless shifting ceased. Even the businessman who had complained earlier lowered his gaze, embarrassed by his impatience. The passengers watched in quiet awe as this girl, who had seemed so invisible, had done what wealth and authority could not. Charles stared, his pride warring with gratitude. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself it was coincidence, but he couldn't deny what he saw. His son, at peace for the first time in hours, lay sleeping in the arms of a girl who had nothing to her name but a backpack and a quiet courage that defied circumstance. Yet as Amara continued to hold the child, a subtle tension stirred in the air. It wasn't just admiration that filled the cabin, it was the silent weight of prejudice. A few passengers exchanged looks, whispers passing like currents beneath the silence. Not everyone approved. Not everyone liked the image of a wealthy white man's child resting against the chest of a poor black girl. And though Amara didn't notice at first, that unease was about to grow louder, sharper, and far more cruel than the cries of a restless baby. The cabin remained unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't born of peace but of a collective holding of breath. Amara, swaying gently with the baby still pressed against her shoulder, kept humming her grandmother's lullaby. She felt the child's breathing grow steady, his small chest rising and falling against her arm. Relief softened her features, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the tension had dissolved. But then came the whispers. "They just let her hold the baby?" a woman muttered, her voice low but sharp enough to carry. "I wouldn't trust that. You never know with people like her." "Exactly," another voice chimed in, this time a man in a pressed shirt and loosened tie. "What if she drops him? Or worse?" Amara's ears caught fragments, though she tried to block them out. She wasn't surprised. Life had taught her that some people never saw beyond skin color or circumstance, but it still stung. Her hands tightened slightly around the child, protective, careful, as if shielding him not just from harm, but from the venom of prejudice itself. Charles heard it too. He shifted in his seat, his jaw clenching. Part of him wanted to silence them, to defend the girl who had done what he could not. But another part, the part shaped by years of entitlement and pride, held him still. He wasn't used to defending anyone outside his circle. He wasn't sure he even knew how. The flight attendant appeared, her polite smile faltering as she glanced at the scene. "Sir," she addressed Charles first, carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of Amara. "Do you want me to take the baby back?" Charles hesitated, glancing between his son, sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours, and the girl holding him with such natural ease. He shook his head slowly. "No, let him rest." The attendant forced another smile, but her eyes betrayed discomfort. She nodded curtly and retreated, though whispers trailed in her wake. Amara's heart thudded. She knew she was on borrowed grace. At any moment, someone could demand she sit down, that she hand back the child. But until then, she swayed and hummed, clinging to the fragile calm she had created. Her song was a shield, her embrace a sanctuary, even if temporary. The minutes passed. The baby slept, and with each passing second, the earlier tension seemed to soften. Passengers returned to their books, their movies, their restless naps, but the relief was not unanimous. A woman in pearls, sitting across the aisle, finally leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Excuse me," she said, her tone directed not at Amara but at Charles. "Do you really think it's wise to let her handle your child? You don't know her. She could be dangerous." Amara froze. The words hit harder than she expected, not because they were unfamiliar, but because of the audacity, the willingness to dehumanize her while she held a child, her only crime being who she was. Charles stiffened. "She seems to be doing just fine," he replied curtly. The woman pursed her lips. "Fine for now, but babies are fragile. You can't just hand them off to anyone who offers. It's irresponsible." "Maybe it's more irresponsible," Charles shot back, his voice edged with irritation, "to sit and complain instead of appreciating that my son is finally quiet." The woman huffed and sank back in her seat, muttering something about standards slipping. Amara's chest tightened, but she didn't speak. She had learned silence was sometimes the only defense in moments like these. Still, her pride swelled quietly, not because Charles had defended her fully, but because the baby's steady breaths proved her worth in a way no insult could erase. But the moment wasn't safe for long. A man 2 rows back suddenly raised his voice. "This is ridiculous! If the kid's father can't control him, then that's on him. Why should we have to trust some stranger? I don't care if the baby's asleep. I don't feel comfortable with this situation." His words were met with a few nods, some murmurs of agreement. Not everyone, but enough to remind Amara of the world she lived in. A world where her presence was always questioned, her intentions always doubted. The baby stirred faintly, sensing the rising tension, and Amara instinctively tightened her embrace, whispering softly in his ear to keep him calm. Charles turned in his seat, his face hardening. "Enough," he snapped, his voice carrying through the cabin. "She has done more in the last 20 minutes than any of you could. My son is sleeping because of her. If you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine." The cabin fell silent again, though this time it was laced with unease. Some passengers looked away, ashamed, while others folded their arms, unwilling to concede. Amara, still swaying, kept her focus on the child. But inside her, a storm brewed. She didn't want gratitude that came reluctantly, nor defense that was half born of frustration. She wanted dignity. Respect. She wanted the world to see that she was more than the color of her skin, more than the poverty they assumed defined her. As the flight stretched onward, Amara remained standing, her arms aching but steady. Hours passed, and the baby slept peacefully, waking only once to fuss briefly, before dozing again at the sound of her lullaby. The passengers who had doubted her the loudest avoided her eyes now, their earlier disdain slowly transforming into grudging acknowledgement. Charles watched her closely. He saw the patience in her movements, the quiet strength in her gaze. For the first time, he wondered what her life was like, this girl who seemed to know so much about comfort despite having so little herself. He wanted to ask, but pride held him back. Instead, he sat in silence, letting his thoughts unravel in the hum of the engines. When the captain's voice eventually crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent, relief rippled through the cabin. Passengers stretched, gathered belongings, and prepared for landing. Amara gently returned the baby to Charles's arms. The child stirred but remained calm, his tiny hand clutching briefly at her sleeve before letting go. "Thank you," Charles said quietly, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't easy for him. Admitting gratitude to someone he had initially dismissed, someone the world around him still judged so harshly. But he said it anyway. Amara gave a small nod, her expression calm. He just needed someone to listen to him, she replied softly, as though speaking not only of the baby but of something much larger. The plane touched down. Passengers filed out, some offering fleeting glances at the girl they would later forget, others carrying the discomfort of their own prejudice with them. Amara walked alone, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her footsteps steady. But Charles lingered. Something about her patience, her quiet courage, her refusal to bend beneath the weight of judgment, gnawed at him. For the first time in a long time, the millionaire felt small, as though his wealth meant nothing in the face of a truth he had witnessed at 30,000 feet. Dignity could not be bought, and respect could not be demanded. And though Amara thought the moment would end there, left behind with the turbulence and stale cabin air, life had other plans. For what she had done on that flight was about to follow her into a world where prejudice ran deeper than whispers, and where the courage to stand tall would be tested again, this time on the ground, where far more than a baby's comfort was at stake. The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Families rushing with strollers, business travelers glued to their phones, the metallic echo of suitcase wheels on polished floors. Amara moved quietly through it all, her backpack snug against her shoulders. For her, traveling wasn't about luxury or leisure. It was necessity. She had scraped together the money for this flight with part-time jobs and sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. She was traveling to attend a scholarship interview, the kind of opportunity that could change everything if she dared to believe it might be hers. Behind her, Charles walked at a slower pace, his infant nestled against his chest now in a soft carrier. He kept his eyes on the girl, not out of suspicion, but out of something he couldn't yet name. Respect? Guilt? Perhaps both. He was used to being the one observed, the one people whispered about when he entered a room. But on that flight, all eyes had been on her. As Amara reached the exit doors, a voice stopped her. "You there?" She turned to see a uniformed airport security officer striding toward her. His face was stern, his tone authoritative, in that familiar way that made Amara's stomach drop. She had been here before, not in this airport, not in this exact moment, but in countless versions of it. Stopped, questioned, doubted, all because of who she was and how she looked. "Yes?" Amara said carefully, her voice polite but cautious. "Step aside," the officer ordered. "We received a report." Her heart sank. She didn't need to ask what kind of report. Already, people were glancing their way, curiosity sharpening into suspicion. The whispers began again, just as they had on the plane. "What's happening?" someone muttered. "Probably stole something," another guessed. Amara lifted her chin. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's expression didn't soften. "That's what we'll determine." "Empty your bag." Amara froze. She wanted to protest, to demand fairness, but experience told her how quickly such defiance could escalate. With trembling hands, she unzipped her backpack, revealing nothing more than a change of clothes, a notebook, and a worn paperback book. The officer rifled through it carelessly, as though searching for guilt itself. "She was holding his baby," a woman's voice called from the crowd, pointing at Amara. "On the plane. I told you it wasn't safe." The word spread like wildfire, confirmation to those already inclined to believe the worst. "She was after the child," someone whispered. "Probably planned to—" "Stop!" Charles's voice boomed across the hall, silencing the crowd. He strode forward, his son secure in his carrier, his eyes flashing with anger. "This is absurd," the officer straightened, surprised. "Sir, with all due respect, we received complaints." "Complaints from who? From people too blinded by prejudice to see the truth?" Charles's voice cut through the murmurs. He pointed at Amara. "That girl is the reason my son is calm right now. For hours, she did what I could not. She soothed him. She gave him peace. "And now you dare accuse her of something unthinkable?" the officer faltered, glancing between the wealthy man and the trembling girl. Authority often bent more easily in the presence of money and influence. "Sir, if she was helping, then perhaps—" "Not perhaps," Charles snapped. "She was helping. And I will not stand by while you humiliate her." The crowd grew restless. Some passengers from the flight looked down in shame, remembering their earlier whispers. Others remained skeptical, their silence carrying its own indictment. Amara stood frozen, her chest tight. She wasn't used to anyone defending her, certainly not a man like Charles Whitmore. She had expected him to walk past, to let her fend for herself as so many had before. But here he was. His words as sharp against injustice as her lullaby had been gentle against the baby's cries. The officer cleared his throat. "I apologize, miss," he said reluctantly, stepping back. "You're free to go." But the damage was done. The stares lingered. The judgment hung in the air like smoke. Amara gathered her bag with trembling hands, her dignity bruised but unbroken. She wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating eyes. But Charles stopped her with a quiet word. "Wait." She turned, wary. "I owe you more than thanks," he said, his tone softer now. "You gave my son comfort when I couldn't. And you stood tall, even when they doubted you. That kind of strength, it's rare." Amara shook her head slightly. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just knew what he needed." Charles hesitated, then asked the question that had been pressing at him since the flight. "Where are you going? What's next for you?" Her eyes lowered briefly. "I have an interview. A scholarship program. If I get it, maybe I can change things for myself, for my family." He studied her for a long moment. The millionaire in him thought of money, influence, opportunity, things he had in abundance. But the father in him thought of values, of the lesson his son might one day learn from this girl's courage. "Then let me help," he said finally. Amara stiffened. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Charles said firmly. "It's recognition. Recognition that dignity like yours deserves a chance to grow. You gave without asking. Let me do the same." Her eyes searched his, uncertain. Trust wasn't easy when life had taught her otherwise. But something in his gaze told her this wasn't pity. It was respect. The days that followed moved swiftly. True to his word, Charles used his connections not to buy her future but to open doors she had been locked out of. The scholarship committee, once inclined to dismiss a girl like Amara, found themselves looking more closely, seeing not just a name on paper, but a story that demanded to be heard. Her interview was no longer a formality. It became a platform. She spoke of resilience, of carrying her brother on weary nights, of singing lullabies through hunger and fear. And when she was done, the room was silent, not with prejudice, but with awe. She won the scholarship, but more than that, she won something even she hadn't expected. Charles kept in contact, not as a savior but as a witness. He watched her grow, supported her ambitions, and most importantly, taught his son, through her story, what true strength and dignity looked like. Years later, when Amara stood on a stage to accept an award for her achievements, she saw Charles in the audience, his son beside him, clapping with pride. She smiled, not because she owed him thanks, but because their lives had crossed in a way that neither prejudice nor wealth could erase. And though the world had once whispered against her, she had turned those whispers into a song, a lullaby not just for a restless child, but for a restless society, reminding them all that dignity cannot be denied, no matter how loudly ignorance tries to cry.